tonight I'm going to be comparing two different versions of the Phantom of the Opera, and as is the case with such classics as Dracula and Frankenstein, this story has gone through many different interpretations, and I've always loved the Phantom just from an aesthetic standpoint. Um, like, for one thing, I just think he looks really cool. I know he's not like the craziest looking monster, but I just like the look of the mask and the way that he dresses. And I also love that it's this gothic horror story that takes place in such a beautiful setting. And that also involves this type of music that I've been listening to since before I could talk. I mean, there's a reason why my usual intro when it comes to movie discussions plays music from Carmen. I actually specifically made a request for that type of music. The only problem for me when it comes to this story is that I have yet to see a telling that is actually perfect in my eyes. When it comes to movies that I won't be talking about, I have seen the version with Claude Rains, which I didn't personally care for. Don't get me wrong, I do think Claude Rains kicked ass as the Invisible Man, but his Phantom of the Opera was just okay. I've also seen the version with Robert Englund, who is another great actor. Loved him as Freddy Krueger. Loved him as, I think his name was Mayor Buckwheat in 2001 Maniacs. But his Phantom of the Opera movie was just horrible. And there was another older movie I saw when I was a kid where the Phantom was, for some reason, a good guy. And he dies at the end after saving someone from a falling object. And that's also when he decides to rip his mask off just for the sake of the money shot. Yeah, not the most exciting cinema there. One version that I haven't seen yet that I would actually like to at some point is Dario Argento's version. But the two versions that I'm going to be comparing tonight are the ones that I have seen and liked so far, and those would be the original silent movie with Lon Chaney and the most recent version with Gerard Butler. And yeah, I'm going to be doing another comparison involving a musical. Don't worry though, there won't be any after this. I've never seen the original Sweeney Todd. So getting into what the original did best, there's something that actually surprised me as I was revisiting these two versions, because it had been such a long time since I'd watched either of them, and that would be the fact that the original was actually really funny. Once the Phantom appears on screen, it does become a much darker film, but before that, there is a lot of comedy to, give you this sense of enjoyment before, it becomes a full-blown horror movie. There's some physical humor involving Carlotta's mother as well as some of the stagehands, and there is a little bit of humor in the musical version as well, but I don't know, personally I just prefer old school slapstick humor, so in my opinion the original does the comedy a lot better. Also, I just prefer the look of the opera house in the original, especially, during the scenes that take place backstage. There are a lot of these really surreal looking set pieces, which I think are just interesting to look at. It is beautiful to look at in the remake as well, but there isn't quite as much imagery, at least not as much above ground, that really pops out. And this is actually a pretty rare thing where, as far as remakes are concerned, but the special effects in the original were a lot better. I mean, when you see the Phantom's deformed face in the musical version, it is a more realistic deformation, and it is fairly effective. You do kind of feel sorry for the guy, but when you're thinking about the Phantom of the Opera unmasked, Lon Chaney definitely had the more memorable face with this sort of cadaver-like appearance. And, you know, when I read about the makeup and find out just how painful it was, but also how very simple the application was, it's pretty amazing. And above all, I think that the Phantom himself is portrayed better in the original version. I do like the way that they do him in the musical as well. He is a very sympathetic character, and I think his backstory is fairly interesting, but I'm not really a huge fan of how much they romanticize the character. You know, in the original, he's still lovesick over this woman, Christine, but he still comes off as a very threatening and menacing figure, and he has a genuine presence in the movie. In fact, it's actually pretty rare for Universal monsters to still be able to come off as scary to this day, and I think that the Phantom pulls that off. And then another thing is he is just as sympathetic as the one in the musical. There are certain lines that make you feel sorry for the character. You know, whereas a lot of Universal monsters, you know, don't really hold up to this day and they're not as scary as they used to be back in the 30s and 40s. I think one of the main things that's just kept them immortal as public icons is that they are the types of characters that you can feel sympathy for, and the Phantom is really no exception to the rule. And despite the fact that I just said that his backstory in the musical version is interesting, I do like the fact that they keep it a little more vague in the original, although the way that they presented it was really weak. Like, just because this loose scrap of paper says it must mean it's true. I thought that was kind of stupid, but yeah, still, overall, the Phantom in the original wins. So, moving on to what the musical version does better, it actually gets quite a bit done better, to my surprise. For one thing, I did say that the Opera House in the original was more interesting to look at above ground, but in the musical, I love the way that they do the catacombs and the Phantom's Lair. I love how they have, you know, actual actors sticking out their arms through this wall to hold these candlesticks. That was a really cool visual. And then, you know, when these, I think they're called candelabras, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but when these candelabras are coming out of the water with their candles lit, it's pretty cheesy, but it's also pretty awesome to look at. So, you know, definitely the Phantom's Lair wins in the musical version. Aside from the Phantom himself, pretty much every character in the cast is done better in the musical version. Um, and I don't want to stomp on the original too much. I mean, I know it's a classic, but a lot of the characters in it didn't really have much depth outside of the monster. It's as if they put the most work into making him the most memorable character, and it worked. But I do like how the cast overall, you know, just has more depth in the musical version and are, for the most part, more believable. But I'm going to start with someone who is arguably less believable than she was in the original, but still left more of an impression, and that would be the character of Christina's rival, Carlotta. Now, in the original film, she's mostly just represented by her obnoxious mother, who is a very funny character, but you never really know anything about Carlotta as a person other than that she's an opera singer that the Phantom doesn't like very much. You only see her in one scene of the film where she's singing this opera piece before the Phantom comes in and messes things up. In the musical version, she is obnoxious. You can clearly see why the Phantom hates her so much. And, you know, even though making a character more annoying doesn't always make them better, at least they gave her something in this movie. And you're almost on the Phantom's side in this version. You kind of see him want to just off the woman because she is such a grating character. Also, Raul is easily miles better in the musical version than he was in the silent film. And I mean, honestly, if there's anyone out there who likes the Raul from the silent version of Phantom of the Opera more, please tell me why. I genuinely need to know because he doesn't do shit in the original silent film. Um, I even took notes in preparation for this thing. As I was watching all of these movies back to back, I had to be able to remember later what comparisons I was going to make. And, I wrote down Raul's name as I was watching the original, but I didn't take any notes on that side of the paper because he never did shit in the movie. He and Christine fall in love with each other, and he becomes the damsel in distress at one point. But other than that, he doesn't do anything. Um, so moving on to how he was done in the musical version, for one thing, I love that there is more genuine chemistry between him and Christine. He's been admiring her for a very long time, and you can actually feel a connection between these two. Um, and she doesn't fall for the Phantom as easily, so she doesn't feel like she's just kind of jerking herself back and forth between the two characters. She does feel like she's more attracted to Raoul in this version. Also, he's more of a man of action. When Christine's in trouble, he actually stands up against the Phantom and fights him. So, yeah, definitely the musical takes the point on this one. And I genuinely think that Christine is done better in the musical version. Um, I've already covered the fact that she falls for Raoul more than the Phantom, and the thing that makes this better is just the fact that it's more believable. He's this person that she's met face to face, and she kind of knows, whereas the Phantom is just this creeper who's been talking to her through the walls for years. And she is kind of drawn to him, but she also reveals that she's very terrified of him, which makes perfect sense. In the original film, she falls for the Phantom head over heels, before she realizes that he is, in fact, the opera ghost that everyone has been talking about. And I also remember that scene where she was given the choice to turn one of these two switches, and for one thing, that scene was just cheesy as hell. For another thing, she just didn't come off as very likable, but I definitely liked her a lot more in the musical version for sure. So in the end, I would not personally consider this a tie, and I'll get into why that is in a moment, but each film has received 4 points on its own. The original does the humor, the opera house, the special effects, and the Phantom better, whereas the musical has got the Phantom's Lair, Carlotta, Raoul, and Christine going for it. But when you consider which movie would be better to view in October, a horror film is only as good as its antagonist. It matters which one scares you more. So I would personally consider the silent film to be the better between the two. They're both very good. They do come equally recommended. But if you haven't seen either version and you're wondering which one you should watch for Halloween this year, definitely check out the original. Anyway, that's all I've got to say for this comparison. I will see you tomorrow.